Hi, this is Joanna. I'm talking today about the Hoag and Bensi article, Values Underpinning STEM Education in the USA, an analysis of the next generation science standards. And I just identified kind of the NGSS in this broader historical context of standardization, like writing standards and then assessment. So I listed some important dates there that I thought were reasonable. These NCTM, that's the National Council for the Teaching of Mathematics, on curriculum standards, those started in '89, and then they've had a couple iterations after that. And then most recently, of course, the Common Core State Standards 2010, of which the NGSS standards are used to kind of augment those because these standards are about science, and there are not specific detailed standards in the Common Core around science. So the standards broadly are for grades 1 through 12. There's an introductory policy and 13 appendices. And then you'll see the purpose of the standards. This is a quote, is to instill aptitudes and orientations in all students conducive to science-related jobs, which can then support development of national and global economics. So Hoag and Bensi outlined this research problem, which the question is, what are just about values? What are some of the values prioritized in the NGSS? How are these discursively constituted, and what are the implications for science education based on these standards? Sorry. So in the framework, they gave a definition of discourse as sets of practices and or knowledge that construct reality and provide a shared way of producing meaning, forming subjects, and regulating conduct within particular societies and institutions at particular historical times. And then they rely on three assumptions from their framework, that values are embedded in discourse and then are distributed to the educational sector. That policy is a significant way in which educational discourses are disseminated, which is particular here. And then when policy is written by private groups, educational discourses are being written by them and not by local communities. And they have an emphasis on these private group authorship here that comes into play every so often. So for their methodology, they looked at 250 pages of NGSS supporting documents and then the written standards. And for their procedure, they used this kind of top-level framing where they looked at the text as a whole, what they called this meso-level analysis, and created themes for each paragraph. Then within relevant paragraphs is what they say. They did a micro-level discourse analysis, and they looked for 5 things there: unspoken assumptions, meaning conveyed by words, internal relations in the text, how language contributes to particular meaning, and privileged ways of knowing and speaking. Kind of mirrors some of the things that we've talked about, both through G and Fairclough, and through, if you think through those things that are back in Rogers, kind of those textual tools are kind of also parallel these. And then the third, they did a content analysis to look for participatory or non-participatory discourses. So I'm going to go very quickly through results because I assume you read this, and then most of kind of the, I think, main stuff is in the discussion and conclusion. So they identified 3 themes: performance, accessibility, and innovation, and then they did this content analysis. They use word counts some, but then they define performance, and especially results from performance that maybe are interesting, or that the desired outcome according to the standards are not knowledge but performance that can be objectively measured. From table 4, these are the content analysis that they kept going back to. They said that 59% of these were highly performative or non-participatory knowledge and practice in these performance expectations. 40% are moderately performative, meaning either they had participatory knowledge or participatory practice, but not both. and then less than 1% are participatory in knowledge and practice, and that comes up in the analysis on accessibility and innovation also. Accessibility is a second theme, mostly here that in the standards they found accessibility was defined kind of in terms of equal opportunity, and that there was a lot of emphasis placed on both teacher and student to make the standards accessible, or for students to access the standards. And then here you see their kind of mid-level conclusion that because 59% of the standards are non-participatory, they limit accessibility. And then innovation and creativity, this is a short paragraph on page 13. It's undefined, but it's dependent on relationships between engineering, innovation, and creativity. Again, the practices, not knowledge, seem to rely on innovative practices. This is where innovation comes in. But again, in this content analysis, only 6% of performance expectations were coded as participatory in practice. So then they concluded that this may limit opportunities for innovation. Okay, through the discussion, they primarily were trying to make this argument in favor that there were neoliberal discourses throughout the policy document. That performances should be measurable and reproducible. Accessibility is based on individual effort and equality of opportunity. And that innovation can be learned and developed through prescribed practices. And in some ways, the argument here is that innovation is a commodity. So for my analysis, I will talk a little bit. I think there are a lot of strengths in this paper, and especially right up until I got to the discussion, to me, it just felt like so solid. So the research problem and question are well established, and I understood why they might be asking it or the need for it. Methodology was understandable and very well explained in my mind. I did have this small question on what a relevant paragraph was, and I would have appreciated a single sentence about how that was defined. The theoretical framework was well established too, making assumptions underlying the study apparent. And I just thought the results were very well written. These tables and figures and the ways that they moved back and forth between the analysis and the original text, and then how they did the discourse analysis, especially I think that's table maybe 1, is that? Was just really, yeah, like table 1 is just like really lovely to kind of look at. My critiques around these claims about neoliberalism, I thought the performance argument and the argument around accessibility were pretty solid. The performance argument is very solid. Accessibility, this argument hinges on accessibility being defined as equality of opportunity. So then success or access is due to individual kind of effort. And that is kind of a neoliberal. It was a little, I've said here, muddled for me on page 16, where they were making an argument about community-grounded science versus kind of this privately authored science. And maybe this is, you'll see I'll come back to this later, maybe this is where I lost their argument and didn't know exactly what they were trying to get for. And I have this question, which is it reasonable to expect kind of this global, or maybe it's not global, but national solution to rely and build on local knowledge? And what would the standards look like that could kind of straddle both those needs, like this kind of standardized national standards and also relying on local knowledge? I didn't have a sense of what that might be. And then when it moved to the innovation creativity argument, I got lost here about how this supported their overall theme that these were neoliberal discourses, and I could not see. I mean, I understand they're trying to make a connection between innovation as a commodity and the neoliberal emphasis on entrepreneurship. But like to me, the results from their actual analysis mostly just showed that these NGSS standards like would talk about innovation, but really and talk about creativity, but when they were enacted and in the actual kind of performance expectations, that innovation and creativity weren't valued. And so they had interpreted that as kind of a limited creativity that would feed the market. And I just think it was kind of a dissonance in the actual NGSS standards. But so, so that connection, the innovation creativity connection to this neoliberal discourse was less clear to me. But maybe in the comments, if it was clear to y'all, that I would love to kind of hear about that. I got a little lost in here. Also, when I got to the conclusion, there was a lot of stuff in here that I kind of didn't follow, and I think it leads back to things, pieces of the argument that I didn't follow when they were happening in the article. So from the first paragraph, therein lies a potential problem with the development of NGSS. Their production by private actors appears incongruent in many ways with democratic values that are important for public school education. I am not sure that I really thought they made a case that the private actors part was very influential here. I mean, neoliberal discourses are really present in a lot of sectors, not just in kind of private entities or in like private industries. So that this connection where they're trying to kind of connect this with the authorship was a little weak to me. The second paragraph, which they conclude by saying STEM educational reforms could flood the labor force with STEM workers, creating greater competition, resetting a higher bar for worker performance with lower pay. I have not heard that argument before, and I'm not sure how it kind of contests the neoliberal argument. I mean, you're still making an argument around whether or not people should enter STEM because of its market value, and so I'm not sure it's actually doing what they want it to do. But I think the last paragraph is kind of the fundamental idea that I took away from this article, which is like how this discourse resists alternative ways of teaching and learning. Local communities might be more critically aware of the need for liberal and alternate interpretations of the knowledge and practices outlined in the NGSS. So kind of helping communities think through whether or not they want to implement these as written or change them seems reasonable to me, and especially around these ideas of accessibility, the ways that the NGSS documents are not kind of living up to their kind of goal of accessibility and not living up to their goal of innovation and creativity, maybe seems like the biggest takeaway for me. So final thoughts. They are using multiple forms of analysis. It was unclear to me if they needed to use another kind of document source to triangulate this neoliberal argument from other sorts of science policy documents. It's also not clear how much critical discourse analysis was actually done. This idea of relevant paragraphs was a bit fuzzy that I wasn't sure. And then I just had kind of the written versus enacted curriculum. It's unclear how these NGSS documents are being utilized by local school districts, and how influential they are. And I think it would have helped me a little bit to kind of understand that for the article. And then again, the conclusion for me was just a little either muddled, or I didn't reach the same conclusions, or they did not kind of convince me of these concluding thoughts that they had through their argument. Okay, I think that's all I have, so thanks very much. I look forward to kind of the discussion that's happening in the discussion board.